So like you've got like the consistency argument, like, look, I can't argue against you. But when it comes to the real world, I want to talk about this topic and engage with the people in a way that I think is going to lead to the world being a better place.
That was Humane Hancock, and you are listening to Sinta with Soytheist. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Soytheist. Welcome to another episode of Sinta with Soytheist. Sinta is the Assamese word for thinking. Today I'm joined by Jack Hancock, better known online as Humane Hancock. So Jack, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. Good to be here.
Yeah. Okay, so Jack, for those who might not know you, could you just briefly introduce yourself? Who is Humane Hancock exactly?
Sure. How deep do you want me to go with this? I'm joking. So I started off, I guess, as a purely vegan activist. I learned about what was happening to farmed animals, thought it was terrible, and became an activist myself after becoming vegan. And I was very much inspired by watching people on YouTube, the likes of Earthling Ed and Joey Carbstrong. So it kind of felt natural to me to start doing the same kind of things they were doing to promote veganism. So I started doing street interview content and talking to the camera. So I did that for a couple of years. And as I did that, I started to think about ethics more broadly. So that led me onto thinking about wild animal suffering. So now I do spend quite a lot of time trying to raise awareness about the issue of wild animal suffering in the vegan community. On top of that stuff, I'm actually also working on a documentary. The working title is The Dying Trade. That could be changed. But one of the facts that people find kind of interesting about me, I guess, is that my father is a slaughterhouse worker. And I was thinking, there were some polls about what's kind of promoting the veganism effectively, and documentaries keeps coming up. It seems that a lot of people are inspired to make behavior changes through watching documentaries. So I was thinking about that and what I could do. And because my father's the slaughterhouse worker, it kind of felt intuitive that, that's a concept that hasn't really been covered in a documentary before. And one of the issues, as you know, is getting people to actually watch footage. It's kind of hard to get someone to watch something like Dominion or Land of Hope and Glory. But my thinking is that we can tell a story of the slaughterhouse workers, and in doing so, they'll also tell a story of the farmed animals. So sorry if that was a bit rambly, but that's kind of where my time is going to at the moment.
No, that's perfect, right? So glad to have you on the channel. So Jack, the way I like to do things on this podcast is on a lot of issues, I tend to agree with my guests. So to ensure that we are not just sitting here having a good time, I'll be playing the devil's advocate on some of these issues, and on other issues on which we disagree, I'll just be the devil, so to speak. So anyway, with that cleared up, as you've already touched upon, as vegans, we seem to be aware that humanity has this ethical blind spot, right? With regard to animal suffering, people tend to speak about justice and fairness and all that kind of stuff. But the moment you try to point out this grave area where it's causing so much suffering, people just seem to be unaware of that and just tend not to realize the gravity of the issue. An issue that you have pointed out is that vegans too seem to have an ethical blind spot within veganism itself. And as you've mentioned, that is the suffering of wild animals. So how is it so the thing is that when we, as vegan activists, we try to speak about why it is a problem that we're killing animals and eating them and exploiting them, we tend to say that the problem here is, for amongst other reasons, that this is slavery, right? This is the enslavement of innocent beings for our temporary pleasure. Right? But when we're talking about wild animals, right, are these animals not the ones that are free from slavery? Right? So how is that a problem? How is their condition not the optimal one?
Good question. So one thing I want to point out, and I do believe that this is a moral blind spot that we see within the vegan community, but I think it's a blind spot that we see within every community. I think it's a blind spot that we all have, and there are going to be many, many factors that contribute to that blind spot. You know, I think we tend to, not just vegans, everyone, I think we tend to romanticize nature and the lives of wild animals. In reality, their lives seem to be pretty tough. They have to deal with things like starvation, disease, predation, accidents, weather conditions. I think one of the reasons why we tend to romanticize it is because we're so disconnected from it, because we haven't got to deal with being eaten by a lion. We haven't got to, most of us are lucky enough to be able to come inside when it's cold and to get treatment when we're unwell. So that's the first thing I want to point out, is that like this is a blind spot that I think we all have. With your question, these animals are kind of free from the tyranny of human beings. So what is the problem? Well, yes, they are. They, generally speaking, wild animals can be free from human exploitation, but that doesn't mean their lives are free from suffering. As I mentioned, there's like lots of ways in which animals can suffer. And I think when we try and think about this from the perspective of the wild animal, the one whose experience we're trying to consider here, they don't care whether their suffering is caused by a human or some parasite or a natural disease. They won't know the difference. What they care about is their experience and their suffering. Whether or not the idea that we should only care about the suffering we cause, that's only a concept that humans could make up, not the wild animals. The wild animals just want to be free from suffering and enjoy their lives. So there's no reason to think, you know, when we think about natural selection by evolution, there's no reason to think that it would create an optimal state for the well-being of wild animals. What's being optimized for is a replication of genes, which isn't even remotely similar. And, you know, I've already given some examples of the ways in which wild animals suffer. So yeah, that's my answer there. Sorry if these are a bit long-winded. I have a lot to say on this issue.
No, that's perfect. Like, you briefly mentioned them, right? But what kind of suffering are we talking about here? Like, could you just list them out? Like, what are the main sources of wild animal suffering?
Well, that's a much more complicated question than you would imagine, because wild animal suffering is such an incredibly neglected topic. I mean, maybe there's like around 20 people around the world working on this issue. We really haven't got much empirical data on what the lives of wild animals are actually like. So really what people in this movement are promoting is more research. Let's actually learn about what kind of experiences wild animals are having, how bad different experiences and different ways of dying could be for them. So like that's the real answer to that question. But again, I can list some more examples I've already done that, but yeah, like predation, disease, parasites, weather conditions, accidents, starvation, hunting. There are many causes of wild animal suffering that are caused by humans, but it's incredibly vast, an incredibly broad topic. There's also like the psychological suffering. When we think about something like predation, it's not just the physical pain of being ripped to shreds. You also got to consider the fear they experience. So it's like a very complicated issue, and it's an enormous issue, which is one of the reasons why I'm keen to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's useful to sort of get a scale of this, right? Because when we as vegans talk about animal suffering caused by human beings, we tend to mention these numbers. We tend to mention that we kill about 72 billion land animals every single year. We kill trillions of marine animals every single year. And those numbers are just unbelievable. So, like, what about wild animal suffering? How many animals are we talking about here? Are they even comparable?
Again, very, very difficult question to answer. I mean, it's hard to count the number of wild animals, you know, and we're not just talking about mammals, we're talking about like arthropods and insects. So it's like very, very difficult. And the estimates we do have huge error margins. You know, there's a huge range. So it's really difficult to answer this question like with any precision. We have to acknowledge that we're very uncertain. And for people who want to know more about this, there's actually some of the best estimates we have been put together by Brian Tomasic. There's an article, you can just find it by Googling it, how many wild animals are there? But while acknowledging the uncertainty, to answer your question, it's astronomical. we're talking astronomically more than the number of farmed animals in existence. We're talking about numbers that our brains just aren't capable of comprehending.
I see. Like, do you have any range here, like 10 to the power of 15, 18?
I wouldn't want to say anything without the notes in front of me, but those kind of numbers that you're citing there, I mean, that could be just the number of like one type of animal, like just earthworms, for instance, could be that amount, if not more. So it's astronomical.
Right. You had done this video where you're responding to none other than Earthling Ed, right? And the issue that was being discussed there was the issue of starvation that is caused by population growth, right? And like I think Ed was responding to Joe Rogan, who was of the opinion that we should go into the wild and hunt these animals. But Ed is of the opinion that we should introduce wild animals into the wild, right? Predator animals, right? And you said that that's not good because that predation is incredibly painful, right? But is it not the case that starvation, because it lasts so much longer than being hunted down by humans or by non-human predators, is starvation does it not mean then that those solutions are indeed better than what would happen naturally?
Yeah, good question. So trying to compare different ways of dying is again really, really complicated because we haven't got direct access to the experiences of these wild animals. So how does something like starvation compare to being eaten alive? We could imagine that starvation is a process that lasts a lot longer. We could imagine that predation, being eaten, is something that is a lot more intense in a short period of time. I don't know how to kind of compare these and say which one is worse. What I do think is true is that both are bad. So it seems that Joe Rogan and Earthling Ed both agree that there is an issue with starvation, and maybe we should try and do something about it. The question of what to do about it is a complicated and nuanced question. I very much doubt that causing wild animals to be eaten alive would be the most humane Hancock way to deal with the issue. The hunting, again, it's like a violent action, and we can probably find alternatives to control the population sizes of animals that are more ethical and are in keeping with our recognition that these wild animals are sentient and their lives matter. For instance, we could imagine contraception to control the population size of animals. But again, and I feel like I will be annoying and do this quite a lot, I do need to stress that we have a lot of uncertainty about what the best things to do for wild animals are. We don't know. At this point, the researchers who are looking at the issue are just trying to gather information and create an academic field called welfare biology to learn about the lives of wild animals and then learn about the ways in which we could help them. So my perspective isn't that I'm saying, okay, here's the solution. We should go into nature and we should do this to prevent all the starvation. I'm saying that we need to consider the perspective of the wild animals with everything we do, including rewilding, including introducing predators, and including human hunting. But from the perspective of the people looking into this issue, we certainly need far, far more research, and that's what I'm promoting as well.
Right. So as of right now, because as far as I can tell, right, it seems to me at least that the argument that when a human kills a wild animal, that is far less painful than being eaten alive by a lion, for example. Right? Some people make that argument. Do you think that argument holds any merit? And if it does, do you think it justifies hunting?
It seems intuitively true to me that being shot is less painful than being eaten alive, but I don't think that would necessarily justify hunting, because I don't believe that hunting and killing animals, inflicting violence on animals, would be the optimal solution either. I think there are probably going to be more ethical ways for us to deal with this issue. And I think Ed made some really good points in his video where he was saying that hunters will talk as if they're doing this for like conservationist reasons or because it would be worse if the deer dies another way, but that's probably not their true intentions. So like, yeah, my intuition is that like being shot is probably less painful. than being like chased by wolves. But I don't think that would necessarily justify hunting at all.
Like regardless of what we might do in the future, right? Do you think, do you have an argument for why that might be wrong? Because Ed's argument was that it's not natural, but because we recognize that naturalness has nothing to do with it. At the present moment, what is wrong with going out and shooting a wild animal?
Well, because we have well, for one reason, most people's moral systems would entail, or I guess like the general public, I think they have the intuition that like killing is morally wrong in and of itself. But also from like focusing on like wild animal welfare perspective, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty about the knock-on effects of doing that.
I see.
Yeah. So say for instance, like say if I've heard some people in the vegan community talking about like killing predators. Well, like you could kill a predator and then that leads to an increase in the population of prey animals, which then leads to like more starvation, more disease, more like in-group fighting in that species. So it's like there are huge, like very complicated knock-on effects in ecosystems depending on what we do. So I don't think it would be like, I don't think it would be fair to kind of suggest that any given intervention today is going to be like an optimal thing to do because we just don't know yet.
Right. So we don't do anything until we figure it out, sort
of. Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think there are lots of things we're already doing that are causing harm to wild animals, and a good place to start would be to change those things. But yeah, I do think that we should be cautious in terms of like making changes to complex ecosystems, and really like do the research first. Not just because we want to know about like the potential, all the outcomes of as much as we can of what we're doing, but also from like a public perception perspective. It's not good to seem like you're just running in there without knowing what you're doing and making any like kind of large scale changes.
Mm-hmm. I suppose, and a point that could be made is that a lot of people in my country will die horrible deaths because of like diseases like malaria and dengue fever and so forth. But that wouldn't justify someone coming in and shooting them in the head and saying, "See, I saved them from the suffering," right? Yeah, I suppose that's an analogy that could work. What is your take on that?
I think it gets a bit more complicated when we talk about human beings, because human beings are like capable of understanding and giving consent to different interventions. So I actually would be in favor of, if someone wants to die, if they're suffering with a painful disease and they want to have euthanasia to die peacefully, I would be in favor of that, which is actually illegal in the UK, which to me seems completely insane. But now
it's legal. Sorry,
it's illegal. Sorry, it's illegal in the UK to die if you like, to be killed if you want to euthanasia. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But when we move over to like animals, things get a little bit more complicated because they can't give us consent really to the things. So what we do is we try to do what's in their best interest. Interestingly, with like pet animals like dogs, when they're suffering intensely, we feel like it is the compassionate thing to do to put them out of their misery. So it's kind of interesting. With euthanasia, it's like one of these very small cases where in some ways animals are getting treated better than humans. When it comes to wild animals, again, it's complicated. I think that we should do whatever is in their best interest. I think that we should, there's a question that we should ask ourselves, and that's, what if it was me? What would I want in that situation? I can imagine scenarios where a wild animal is suffering incredibly. Let's say they're currently being eaten alive right now. And if I could put them out of their misery, then I would. But again, it's like when we come back to the real world, the effects of all that we do are like very uncertain. So I'm afraid I'm sounding like a broken record here, but like we really need to conduct more research before we can make like sweeping statements about like, whether we should be trying to exterminate certain animals or anything like that, because we just don't know what the effects would be.
Okay, so you briefly mentioned it, right? And I do want to get into it. What do you have any opinion at all on whether or not it's a good idea to kill predator animals?
Okay, I guess there's like a lot of different things I should highlight here. The first being is that while I have been trying to raise awareness about wild animal suffering, I don't have like an action plan of like what we should be doing. What I'm trying to do is trying to just raise awareness about the issue and get people help create help stimulate a research field, really getting people like looking into how we can actually help wild animals and learning about the lives of wild animals. So it's less about a concrete way to intervene in the lives of wild animals and more about creating research. Another thing to mention is that predation is just one cause of suffering in the lives of wild animals, and there are many, many, many others. And it seems like predation is kind of like the poster child for like wild animal suffering, and it seems to be what people very much focus on. But if you actually talk to the researchers in like the wild animal welfare community, they're not focusing on predation at all, because predation is complicated in the sense that it's two agents with a conflict of interest, when there's like lots of causes of wild animal suffering that aren't like that, that the public are much more likely to get behind, and it's like less controversial. And here's the other thing: even if we did want to reduce the population sizes of predators, I don't think killing them would be the best way to go, from an ethical perspective and also from like a general public perspective. I just can't see people getting behind that policy. But we'd be able to reduce their population sizes using contraception, for instance, which I think is much more likely to be the kind of policy that gets passed, and the kind of idea that doesn't make us seem like crazy. And on the question of like, because I'm pretty much utilitarian, so whether or not like killing a being would be like a good or bad thing to do would kind of come down to whether it's increasing or reducing net suffering. And like the question of whether getting rid of a predator would increase or reduce net suffering is like so complicated. And again, we just don't have the data for me to make any like confident claim. And here's like the last thing I'll mention, and that's that even if we were to do the research and we found that there was absolutely nothing that could be done about the problem of predation, there are still many, many other causes of other forms of suffering that wild animals experience. And it wouldn't mean that we can't have a positive impact on the lives of wild animals. So yeah, I'd stress that as well.
Right. That's all very interesting. And like I do want to move on to the other areas here, but I find this very interesting. So I do want to get your opinion on this. So you mentioned that like we have to ask ourselves, what would we want in their position, right? So the thing is that hypothetically, let's say there was this creature that only ate human beings, right? And and in that scenario, we would surely try to exterminate that creature, right? And people say, well, what about the in the case of killing wild predators, the actual ones, people say, well, there could be negative environmental consequences, right? But in this case, if there was a creature that is eating human beings, the existence of that creature is a environmentally good thing, because human beings are just so detrimental to the environment. So given that we would probably kill that creature, why not kill predator animals?
I think you can make an argument from consistency like that, and it can be kind of hard to argue with. So like in a hypothetical, sure, like it might seem inconsistent for me to say that we shouldn't kill them. But I think that when we zoom out of the hypothetical and enter the real world and think, okay, pragmatically, how can we actually help wild animals going forward? What are we going to do? I don't think like talking about like culling predators is like an effective way to promote concern for wild animals, because it's so unbelievably counterintuitive to people. And I don't think it's ever a policy that's going to come into play. So like you've got like the consistency argument, like, look, I can't argue against you. But when it comes to the real world, I want to talk about this topic and engage with the people in a way that I think is going to lead to the world being a better place.
I see. That's good. Okay. You mentioned that there are far more areas which we can focus on, right? And which we might have, in which we are more likely to find a solution, right? So one of these surely has to be diseases, right? Because as you've talked about, we can intervene and sort of reduce the suffering that is caused from diseases, right? So what are the sort of possible ways, I suppose, in which we could do that? Like, is there any research done on that?
Again, like we need like far more. I'm not really like that aware of all of the research in terms of like combating diseases in animals, but I know that we use vaccinations for humans, and we're animals, and we use vaccinations for our pet dogs and our pet cats. And I'm sure that like theoretically, there's no reason we couldn't extend that care to wild animals as well. Of course, getting an injection doesn't seem like a scalable solution to the problem. But this is the thing. I mean, this is why we need like lots more research to try and learn about the ways that we can help wild animals. And yeah, it seems like while disease is also incredibly complicated, it seems that that's probably more tractable than predation.
Right. So as you mentioned, right, we don't quite know that much about like wild animal suffering, right? We know a terrible lot about the suffering of farmed animals. We know about the wild animals whom we catch for sort of for food, right? Given that there is such a disparity in knowledge, uh, shouldn't we just focus our attention on this arena instead of like sort of wasting our resources sort of on that?
I'm very sympathetic to the view that activists should continue focusing on farmed animal suffering. It's not like my goal is to pull people away from farmed animal suffering and onto wild animal suffering. I think farmed animal suffering is obviously more tractable, and like the skills required to make a real difference in terms of building the wild animal welfare community is probably harder to come by. So like I'm sympathetic. If there's vegan activists watching this who are very focused on farmed animal suffering, I'm not saying that you should pull away from that and become a wild animal suffering advocate. But I do think that it's important to be aware of the perspective of wild animals, especially considering like the fact that there are ways in which that we could act to create astronomical more amounts of wild animal suffering. It's not just about the question of whether we're going to go into nature and help wild animals. It's the question of, are we going to ensure that we don't act to make things significantly worse? For instance, I don't think we should just be rewilding lots of areas without considering the perspective of the individual wild animals. There are also like concerns about humans going to the stars and spreading ecosystems full of suffering to additional planets. And there's also a question of digital sentience as well. We could run computer simulations of like wild animals that could potentially include vast amounts of suffering. So I do think it's important to like have this topic on the table, even if it's the case that like that most activists are going to focus their time on farmed animal suffering, which I think is a very reasonable thing to do.
You mentioned that point about focusing on the experience of individuals, right? Instead of like when we talk about animals, right, we tend to talk about them as these groups, these homogeneous groups. Like you say, when we say that sort of species of animals is prospering, what we mean is that they're not endangered, right? Like they're going to be there. First of all, I have something in mind which I don't know if you'd like to discuss. But first of all, what is the problem with that?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So often, like like you said, when we think about wild animals, we do think in terms of these abstractions. We think about the species or the ecosystem rather than the individual. And the difference between these perspectives is that the species can't suffer. The species can't feel pain, whereas the individual can. And to give an analogy to kind of make this clear, like you say, when we talk about abstract concepts like the species, we act as if they're high in number, then it's good. If they're endangered, then it's bad. But if you look at farmed chickens, for instance, you could make a strong argument that they're like the most successful conservation efforts in human history. I mean, there are lots of them. So from a species level, we can say, okay, they're doing really well. They're prospering, if you like. But then if we zoom into the individual chicken, they're not doing very well at all. Their lives are absolutely full of suffering, and we would probably rather not be born than born into a life like that. So if we keep the perspective of the species and the ecosystem, we're actually forgetting about what I think is the most important thing, which is the experience of the individual animals and whether they're good or bad. So that was like a huge shift for me, because I mean, I hadn't really thought much about like, ecosystems and nature before I started really thinking about wild animal suffering. But if you just listen to the language people use when they talk about this issue, it's very much focused on species and not the focus of the individual animals. And I think a lot of people don't actually realize this, and they think that caring about polar bears is about caring about the species. But actually, there is a really important distinction here, and it's a distinction that like I don't think has been recognized enough.
So, Jack, while you've been talking about this, about wild animal suffering, what do you think is the most like best objection that you had to deal with so far?
Good question. So like the vast majority of wild animals are actually very small, like arthropods and insects. And like, I guess one objection that people might find compelling is the uncertainty regarding like the sentience of these animals. Again, like we haven't got much research on like looking into like sentience of animals, but like it like varies depending on on the species, But if it was the case that arthropods and earthworms and insects weren't actually sentient, then that would like significantly reduce the scale of the problem of wild animals. Of course, that wouldn't, even if that was the case, that wouldn't mean that we shouldn't work towards helping all the other types of animals that we know can suffer. The vertebrates who have a backbone, who we know are experiencing something right now, they still need our help. And then, of course, another objection that you hear quite a lot that I think is like very intuitive to people is that like there's nothing we can do. And again, I would just say it's kind of like before the advent of modern medicine, when before we had like the research of how to like improve the human body, it would have also seemed like there's nothing we can do about this. This is so complex and interconnected. But then you do the research, you learn about the ways to help, and then you effectively help. And I would say the same for this issue. I mean, it's far too early and premature to conclude that we definitely will never ever be able to do anything that helps wild animals. That just seems way off, in my opinion. But still, I think like that's like something that people find very intuitive. The idea, like, okay, it's huge, but like, what the hell can we do about it right now?
Another thing that you had mentioned earlier when we were talking about, when I had mentioned the analogy to human beings, is that you mentioned that human beings have this ability to consent while animals don't. So when you're sort of helping them, given that they cannot consent, right? How do you make that intervention justifiably?
I think we make it in the same way that we make interventions on infants and children. They can't give informed consent. They haven't got the capacity to do so, but we do what we think is in their best interest. And in many ways, animals living in the wild are like children. They are of similar sentience and sapience. And we are very powerful in terms of like what we can do. We can decide to help them, or we can decide to let them suffer. And I think that when any being, be it a human or a non-human, is unable to give informed consent, I think that we should do what we think is in their best interest. There's another point about the whole it's not natural argument in terms of intervening and like kind of idealizing nature, and like that, the argument that we shouldn't intervene in nature at all. It's that what we define as nature often seems very arbitrary. So it's often difficult to like answer people's objection when it comes to like the naturalness argument in a good way, because there's like a huge range of like what they could mean. So like, for instance, you could make a very strong argument that human skyscrapers are natural because we are a being who evolved to create them. And you go to like a park in London and people think they're in nature, but actually like these were all planted by humans. So like the line between like what's natural and not is like really, really blurry. And like that's something that I think that's kind of interesting, and I thought I could highlight.
Fair enough. So while we're doing all of this, right? i- i- Don't you think, as some people have accused you of, don't you think that you have a sort of God complex?
Mm. Do I have a God complex? I don't think I have a God complex. I don't think that wanting to help animals out of their suffering means I have any more of a Godplex than, if someone who wants to help humans out of their suffering. Humans are suffering from natural causes all the time. Children are dying from malaria. It's a very natural disease, but people who say this don't have an issue with us distributing malaria nets to children in Africa. And if you just look around us, I mean, we have altered nature and played God in so many ways to improve human well-being. I mean, people are listening to a podcast right now as we talk. I mean, that is not natural. We seem to have no issue changing the natural environment and playing God in order to help humans. And I'm just saying, well, we should do the same for animals as well, because in all of the ways that matter, their capacity to feel and suffer, they're the same. They experience pain and suffering too. And I can't find any reason why we would say that my suffering matters to me and I'm allowed to play God and get surgery when I need it and take medication when I need it. But wild animals, no, that would be playing God. It just seems unbelievably convenient to say that for us, it's not playing God, but for wild animals, if they suffer, then intervening is playing God. We're playing God every day of our lives to improve human well-being. And I think we should also do the same when it comes to animals.
Speaking of having a God complex, when you talk to people on the streets, you seem to have the patience of a god. How do you manage that?
Thanks. Well, like honestly, I don't always feel that patient. I mean, it depends on like which videos you're talking about, but some of the content I've done that's got the most views has been the stuff at a place called Speaker's Corner in London, where people are kind of like arguing and shouting at each other. And I've come away from debates there and just been like, oh my God, like I am like so stressed and I felt so angry. And next time I need to be calmer. And then I upload the video and people are like, oh my God, I can't believe how patient you are. So yeah, I'm not always aware that I'm as patient as like other people think. But I think one of the reasons why maybe like comparatively I seem more patient is because I genuinely really enjoy talking to people, and I really just enjoy having these conversations on the street. Whether it's the most effective thing to me doing is another question, but like I certainly really enjoy it. And another thing to think about is that like I'm a consequentialist. I'm very focused on like the outcomes of what we do, and when it comes to talking to people, I don't think it's beneficial to getting a good outcome to like appear frustrated or get angry. So if we kind of keep our mind on the outcomes and why we're there, then I think it's easier to not get frustrated as well.
That's very interesting. I do want to talk about a little bit about um, how you uh, how you connect with people. Like when you're talking to people, right? Um, do you think it's more useful to like sort of have your own, like explain to them why this is wrong, or would it be more useful to say like, look, what are your beliefs, and maybe like connect the dots for them? Which approach do you think works better in all your advocacy and talking to people?
Certainly the latter. I think it's much easier to try and find the values that this person has and help and ask Socratic questioning to help them understand that veganism or like concern for animals is already in line with their beliefs and their values, as opposed to like trying to change their values. Like, no, you should care about what I care about. I definitely think that the kind of Socratic questioning is a lot more effective on an individual basis compared to like telling someone like what they should believe and what they should think.
Right. Before we wrap up, uh, do you have anything that we missed out on? Do you have anything
Hmm.
you'd like to talk about?
Maybe I'll quickly just mention kind of like a call to action for like what people can do if they're interested in this issue, want to learn more, or like want to help. I think there's a few different things that the activists can do. I think the first thing, and maybe the easiest thing, is just to start raising awareness about the suffering of wild animals, and the perspective of the individual, as you mentioned, as opposed to the perspective of the species or the ecosystem. And I think this is important, especially when we think about the long term, where we could be like rewilding a lot of areas, and the perspective of the individual wild animals should be included. We could potentially spread ecosystems full of suffering to additional planets. There's digital sentience, all of that scary stuff. So raising awareness that wild animals matter, and maybe including it in your advocacy, or having like, it's an interesting topic to talk about, so you can kind of talk about it with like your vegan friends. That's like a good place to start. Also, if you are looking to donate to an effective charity, there are 3 charities working in this space. There's Wild Animal Initiative, who were recently awarded to be one of the top charities in the world for animals by animal charity evaluators. There is Animal Ethics, and there is Rethink Priorities. So there are like 3 options where you could donate if you want to help wild animals in that way. And if you are a student, especially if you're a biology student, you could actually study welfare biology and learn about the lives of wild animals. If you're someone who's thinking about going to university, this area is so incredibly neglected, and there really is a lot of good that can be done here. So I would encourage anyone who's a prospective university student to consider studying biology and learning about the lives of wild animals. And I think that's pretty much it.
So that was all very insightful. It was nice talking to you. Thank you for being on the podcast, and I suppose we can talk again later, and we'll see if any progress has been made, because today, I suppose I realized how much more research there needs to be done on this issue. So I look forward to talking to you maybe in a few years. And we'll see.
That'd be very interesting. Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see what the field is like in 5 years' time, for sure. And I look forward to seeing the other episodes of your podcast. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for being on. And anyway, to my viewers, please note that this podcast is made possible by your support on Patreon. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Soytheist. And I'll see you in the next one.